Going to talk a little bit about how to make a table saw sled. Before we actually get to how to make it, I want to talk a little bit about why you would even want one, to sort of motivate you to consider making one. In normal table saw operations, we do a lot of cross cutting, and that's what we're going to address here with a sled. When you cross cut, you can use a normal miter gauge to measure and push the wood through the saw blade. That's fine, but for repeatability, you have to worry about, if you're going to make repeated cuts, is it going to be the same, each piece going to be the same size. So that's an issue. Another issue is, as you use this miter gauge with different angles, getting it square to the blade is not a simple process, and it's not an exact process. And normally when you cross cut, you want the cut to be exactly square. So for those reasons, we will see that a sled helps you. And I had never built a sled, and I used just this miter gauge for many, many years. I finally got around to building one of these, which, by the way, didn't take all that long, and I'm very happy that I did. It's very useful, and you end up with cuts that are perfectly square, and I will show you how you can repeatability. So the thing about table saws, they have a couple of miter gauge slots that are typically around 3/4 of an inch wide and about 3/8 of an inch deep. So what you want to do is you want to build something that has runners on it. And in this case, you can use hardwood for runners. So if this is a finished table saw sled. If I turn it over, you can see that I have these runners affixed to the bottom. And the first step in making one of these is to cut pieces that are the correct width, which, as I said, is around 3/4 of an inch, and the right depth, which is around 3/8. So you have to custom cut them for your table saw slots. So first you cut those and you lay them into the slots. Then you take an appropriate size piece of in my case, plywood, which is a nice stable surface. So this is 1/2 inch plywood. And as you can see, I laid it on top of the runners. And then I have put screws down into the runners so that the runners are affixed to this piece of plywood. Now, I wouldn't have raised the blade and made this cut yet in the middle of the plywood. This would just be a solid piece of plywood that I attach to the runners. The next thing I need to do is to put these cross pieces both on the end nearest me and on the far end. And the purpose of those is multiple, but mainly what I'm trying to do is, once I cut this center hole for the blade in the piece of plywood, the plywood has to stay together. And so this bridges and it stays together. I've made this one curved because you want it tall to allow the blade and plenty of stability here after you make the cut. But you want to be able to grab it with your hands and push through the blade, and having it lower, I find, is nicer. You can do that, or you can leave it high, whatever you want to do. So I put these onto the plywood, flip it over, and on the one in the back, I put like 8 screws to make sure it's very solid. On the front, I only put in 1 screw, and that's because we have to get it perfectly square, perpendicular to the blade, so that every cut we make is perfectly square. So once I've put both of these pieces on, this with many different screws, this with just 1 screw at the end, then I put this over the blade, turn the saw on, and I bring the blade up to cut, and then I cut through the centerpiece, through this base piece. So then I have your basic configuration. Now what I have to do is get this square. So I take whatever square I have handy, the largest one that you have, making sure that it's accurate, and you put it on the blade and up against this piece of wood, and you square it up as best you can. And you then clamp it and flip it over and put a second screw through here. So now we have one screw over here and one screw here, and this is in a tentative right angle to the blade. Now I use what's called the 5-cut method, where I would take a piece of wood that's rectangular, and I would cut number 1, then I would flip it like this and cut number 2, flip it like this, cut number 3, and then I would come through and do cut number 4. Once I did cut number 4, I have a strip of wood. I leave it at some width, an inch or so, and then you measure each end. And what happens as you turn it through the 5 cuts is you're magnifying the difference, the angle that it's off by 5. And so you measure one end and the other, you subtract, and you know what the difference is. It's going to be so many thousandths of an inch if your square is close. So then you take a feeler gauge, take the screw out, take a feeler gauge and move this the appropriate amount, and then put another screw in at the bottom. So you've adjusted this to be as close to perpendicular to the blade as you can get it. Then you do the 5-cut method again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you measure again. And you want to be within, say, 5 thousandths of an inch difference between the front of the thing and the back of the thing in order for it to be, quote, square enough. So now I have my sled done. What am I going to do with it? Well, the first thing you can do with it is reliably cut perfect 90-degree angles on your crosscut. The second thing you have here is, because you've brought the blade up through the base, the blade is exactly, the kerf is exactly the same width as the blade. So you now have a 0 clearance platform. So when I saw, it doesn't break pieces off, okay? It gives you a nice refined edge. So I have a square edge and I have a perfect refined edge. Additionally, just by looking at these two surfaces on either side of the blade, my measurement is done. So if I happen to have a pencil mark on here, which is where I want the cut to be, then I just line that pencil mark up exactly with that edge, and that's exactly where the cut will be. So I've got a square cut. I've got it exactly where I want because it's 0 clearance. I don't have a lot of tear out on the bottom. Now you can also make the cut repeatable in length by taking, let's say it's that length, take a block of wood here, and I just clamp this block of wood to this surface, and then I can just repeatedly make cuts that are the same length. So again, the advantages: the cut is perfectly square, it's repeatable because you can put a wood surface on here to make it the same every time. It has a 0 clearance so that you don't get a fuzzy edge on the bottom of the cut. And that's about it. Now, this is for square cuts. I also found that when I was trying to do miter joints, like on the edge of, let's say, the corner of a picture frame, where I needed it to be 45 degrees. Well, the way you do that, if you don't have a sled, is you got to use this thing, and you have to try and set it for 45 degrees on this little scale, which you can do, but now I have to take the piece that's going to be the 45, and it's way out here. Okay, so it's very difficult to hold it, and you'll find that this thing, if this wood is not real thick, not real wide, it'll chatter in the blade, and it makes it very difficult to get an exact 45-degree cut. What's the solution? Well, the solution is another table saw sled, and here I made one. Again, runners on the bottom that fit into these two slots, and then I made just put 2 blocks of wood on here that are an exact 90-degree angle, and that's easy to do because I can just simply use a regular square. And then I approximate that it is 45. Remember that it doesn't have to be exact, because if you're cutting all the corners on the same sled, because you cut one this way and you cut the mating surface this way, and they're guaranteed to be 90 degrees. So each one doesn't have to be perfectly 45. Now I put this piece here so that I can push the wood through. So you now see that I can, again, this is a 0 clearance kerf, just wide enough to fit the blade. You can hear that it barely fits the blade. I can put my line right up against that surface, so I know exactly where I'm cutting, the length, and it's very solid because it's supported clear up to where the cut is, so there's no chatter going on. And this sled is pretty darn easy to make. The other sled, the larger square sled, crosscut sled, I use half-inch plywood as the base. Here on this one, I just used half-inch MDF. MDF is cheap, it's flat, and so it makes a very good material to make one of these sleds. This is a push block, and it also helps you keep your hand away from the blade as you push it through. So there you have it, a miter sled and a cross-cut perpendicular sled. Both fairly simple to make. You can make them in an afternoon if you have the materials on hand.